The year was 1875, and the small town of Redemption Creek, nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains, was ablaze with autumn colors. Eleanor Montgomery stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the rolling hills that surrounded her family's sprawling ranch. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, but she barely noticed it, her thoughts consumed by the letter she clutched in her trembling hand. Her father had arranged for her to marry Charles Wellington, the son of a wealthy banker from San Francisco, the man she had met only twice during his brief business trips to their town. A respectable match, her parents had declared, one that would secure the Montgomery name and fortune for generations to come. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching as ranch hands guided cattle across the golden pastures below. Her life had been mapped out since birth. The dutiful daughter of one of the most influential ranchers in Nevada Territory would marry well, bear children, and uphold the family's standing in society. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. I'm curious to know, what city are you watching from today? But Eleanor's heart belonged elsewhere, to a man her family would never accept. She had first encountered him 3 summers ago, when a group of outlaws had attempted to rob her father's stagecoach line. While the other bandits fled when the armed guards returned fire, one man had stayed behind to pull Eleanor from the overturned coach, risking his own capture to save her from the wreckage. That man was Jackson Blackwood, a notorious outlaw with a price on his head and a face marked by scars, one that ran from his left temple to his jaw, earned in a prison fight, and another across his right cheek, a reminder of his first bank robbery gone wrong. In the chaos of that day, something had passed between them, something Eleanor couldn't explain, but felt in the marrow of her bones. Their paths had crossed several times since then, secret meetings arranged through Jackson's only friend in town, the aging blacksmith who had once saved his life. Each encounter deepened the connection between them, despite the impossibility of their situation. She, the cherished daughter of wealth and propriety, and he, a man living by his own code on the wrong side of the law. Eleanor tucked the letter into her dress pocket and moved away from the window, her decision already made, though she dared not speak it aloud. The large Montgomery house bustled with activity as servants prepared for that evening's dinner, where her engagement to Charles Wellington would be formally announced. Her mother had commissioned a new dress from San Francisco for the occasion, silk the color of cornflowers, with delicate lace trim that had been shipped all the way from New York. It was hanging now from her wardrobe, a beautiful cage meant to trap her in a life she didn't want. Eleanor ran her fingers along the expensive fabric, thinking of the rough cotton shirt Jackson had worn when last they met, how it had felt beneath her fingertips when she had tended to a bullet graze on his shoulder. He had told her then of a cabin he owned, hidden in a remote valley 3 days' ride north, a place where no one knew his name or his past. "I can start fresh there," he had said, eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "A man can reinvent himself in this country if he's got reason enough." She knew what he was offering, a life together, far from the judgment of society, far from her family's disapproval. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Eleanor?" "Your mother wishes to know if you'll be down for luncheon," came the voice of Mary, their housekeeper, who had helped raise Eleanor since she was a child. Eleanor cleared her throat, forcing her voice to sound normal. "Yes, Mary, I'll be right down." She crossed to her dressing table, checking her appearance in the mirror, her auburn hair neatly pinned, her green eyes clear, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had become adept at hiding her feelings, at playing the part expected of her, while her mind wandered to windswept ridges where she had shared stolen moments with a man branded by society as irredeemable. Schooling her features into a mask of calm, Eleanor left her room and descended the grand staircase, each step taking her closer to a confrontation that would change the course of her life forever. Her father, Robert Montgomery, waited at the bottom, his broad frame blocking her path, his weathered face creased with the pride of a man who believed he was securing his daughter's future. "There's my girl," he said, extending his arm to escort her to the dining room, where her mother and younger brother were already seated. "Mr. Wellington's son will be arriving on tomorrow's train. The young man is eager to finalize arrangements." Eleanor took her father's arm, feeling the strength in it, the same strength that had built their ranch from nothing, that had fought off rustlers and survived harsh winters. She loved her father deeply, which made what she planned all the more painful. "Father," she began, her voice soft but steady, "may I speak with you privately after lunch? There's a matter I wish to discuss." Robert gave her a curious glance, but nodded, attributing her solemn demeanor to maidenly nerves about her impending engagement. If only he knew the true nature of the storm about to break over their family, Eleanor thought. As they entered the sun-drenched dining room, where her mother's prized silver gleamed on the white tablecloth, the meal passed in a blur of polite conversation and plans for the engagement dinner, each word driving home the reality of what Eleanor was about to do. After lunch, Eleanor followed her father into his study, a room scented with leather-bound books and the tobacco he favored for his pipe. It was here that he had taught her to read, to calculate figures for the ranch accounts, skills many men wouldn't bother teaching a daughter. She wondered if he regretted that now, if he wished he had raised her to be more biddable, less independent in her thinking. "What's troubling you, Eleanor?" Robert asked, settling into his leather chair behind the massive oak desk that had been shipped piece by piece from Boston when she was still a child. Eleanor remained standing, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling. "Father, I cannot marry Charles Wellington," she said, the words tumbling out before she lost her nerve. Her father's expression darkened, the deep creases around his eyes growing more pronounced. "Eleanor, this is not a matter for discussion. The arrangement is beneficial for both families. The boy is educated, comes from good stock, and will provide well for you and any children you might have." She shook her head, feeling tears prick at her eyes, but refusing to let them fall. "I cannot marry a man I do not love, Father. My heart belongs to another." The anger that flashed across Robert Montgomery's face would have cowed Eleanor in her younger years. But she stood her ground, chin lifted in a gesture reminiscent of her father himself. "And who might this mysterious suitor be?" he demanded, rising from his chair, his large hands planted on the desk between them. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing the name she was about to speak would ignite a fury unlike any she had witnessed before. "Jackson Blackwood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but as clear as a gunshot in the quiet room. Her father's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. "The outlaw?" he roared, slamming his fist down on the desk so hard that the inkwell jumped, spilling dark liquid across important papers. "The same man who was part of the gang that tried to rob my stagecoach? Have you lost your mind, girl?" Eleanor flinched, but did not back down. He saved my life that day, Father. You never knew it was him. He's not the man you think he is. He wants to change, to start anew." Robert cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Men like that don't change, Eleanor. They're born with something missing, a moral compass that guides decent folk. Whatever he's told you are lies meant to manipulate a naive young woman." He moved around the desk, grasping her shoulders with hands that had gentled horses and built fences, but now felt like iron shackles on her flesh. "I forbid you to see him again. You will marry Charles Wellington as planned, and we will speak no more of this madness." Eleanor met her father's gaze, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I am of age, Father. I had hoped for your blessing, but I will go with or without it." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of independence that cut deeper than any knife. Robert Montgomery released his grip on his daughter, stepping back as though she had physically struck him. "If you leave this house to be with that criminal, you are no longer my daughter. You will be dead to me, to this family. Is that what you want?" The question echoed in the study, bouncing off leather-bound volumes and polished wood. Eleanor felt the weight of generations pressing down on her. The Montgomery name, the legacy her father had built from nothing after coming west as a young man, with nothing but determination and grit. She saw in his eyes not just anger, but genuine fear for her, belief that she was making a terrible mistake that would lead to ruin or worse. And perhaps he was right, a small voice whispered in her mind. Jackson Blackwood was wanted in 3 territories, had killed men in gunfights, had lived a life so different from her sheltered existence that perhaps they were fooling themselves to think they could build something together. But then she remembered the gentleness in Jackson's touch, despite his rough hands, the way he looked at her as if she were the sunrise after an endless night, the dreams he'd shared of a simple life, honest work, redemption. "I love him, Father," she said softly, the words both a plea for understanding and a final decision. "And I believe in him." Robert Montgomery turned away from his daughter, moving to the window that overlooked the land he had tamed through decades of sweat and sacrifice. "Then you make your choice, knowing the consequences," he said, his voice flat and cold as the first frost of winter. "You will leave this house tonight with nothing but what you brought into this world. The Montgomery name, fortune, and protection will no longer be yours to claim." Eleanor felt the finality of his words like physical blows, each one striking at the foundation of her identity. Who was she, if not Robert Montgomery's cherished daughter? What would her life be without the comfort and security she had always known? But beneath these fears lay a certainty, bone-deep and unshakable, that a life without love, without Jackson, would be no life at all, merely an elegant existence devoid of meaning. "I understand," she whispered, turning to leave the study, possibly for the last time. As she reached for the doorknob, her father spoke once more, his voice softer now, tinged with grief rather than anger. "When he breaks your heart, or worse, do not come crawling back to us. Some choices cannot be undone, Eleanor." She paused at the threshold, her back to the man who had taught her to ride her first pony, who had read to her by candlelight during long winter evenings, who had instilled in her the very independence that now drove her to defy him. "Goodbye, Father," she said, not turning around, afraid that if she saw pain in his eyes, her resolve might waver. Then she was through the door, closing it softly behind her, leaning against the polished wood for a moment as she gathered her strength for what was to come. The Montgomery house continued its daily rhythms around her, a maid dusting the banister, the cook calling for more firewood, her mother's voice floating from the parlor as she discussed dinner arrangements with the housekeeper. None of them knew that by nightfall, the eldest Montgomery daughter would be gone, riding away from everything she had ever known toward an uncertain future with a man her world had condemned. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom on legs that felt leaden, each step taking her further from the life she had always known and closer to one she could barely imagine. Night fell over Redemption Creek like a velvet curtain, stars emerging one by one in the vast Nevada sky. The Montgomery household had retired early, exhausted from preparations for the next day's festivities. Eleanor waited in her darkened room, fully dressed in her riding clothes. Sturdy trousers beneath a practical skirt, a warm jacket, and boots made for long days in the saddle. Her saddlebags lay packed with only the essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the locket containing a small portrait of her family, and the meager savings she had accumulated over the years. She had not taken any of her fine dresses or jewelry, knowing they belonged to a life she was leaving behind. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, each resonant chime marking the end of one existence and the beginning of another. Eleanor moved to her window, opening it silently to the cool night air. 3 stories below, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the stables. Jackson, right on time, leading 2 saddled horses. Eleanor secured a rope to the heavy bedpost, the same rope Jackson had given her weeks ago when they had first formulated this plan. She tossed the free end out the window, watching it uncoil toward the ground. Then she slung her saddlebags over her shoulder, took one last look at the room that had been her sanctuary since childhood, and began the careful descent. The rough hemp burned her gloved hands as she lowered herself, inch by inch, heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. When her feet finally touched the ground, Jackson was there, his strong arms steadying her, his scarred face illuminated by moonlight. "You came," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." Eleanor reached up to trace the scar that ran along his jawline, the mark that had made him infamous, but that she had come to see as simply a part of the man she loved. "I'll always come to you," she replied, the promise hanging in the night air between them. They stood for a moment, absorbing the enormity of what they were doing, before Jackson helped her mount one of the waiting horses. As they rode away from the Montgomery ranch, Eleanor fought the urge to look back at the only home she had ever known. The weight of her father's rejection pressed heavily on her heart, but she fixed her gaze forward, toward the shadowy outline of mountains against the star-strewn sky. Jackson rode beside her, his posture alert for any sign of pursuit. They had planned their escape carefully. They would ride through the night, crossing onto lands unfamiliar to the Montgomery ranch hands by dawn, making their way north through little-traveled paths that Jackson knew from his years living beyond the reach of the law. "We'll be at the cabin in 3 days if the weather holds," he said as they crossed the property line, entering a stretch of wild country that marked the true beginning of their journey. "No one there knows me as anything but a hunter who keeps to himself. We can start fresh, Eleanor. I promise you that." She heard the determination in his voice, the desperation to prove himself worthy of the sacrifice she had made for him. The night cradled them as they rode farther from Redemption Creek, the rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth, the only sound besides the occasional call of a night bird or distant howl of a coyote. Eleanor felt the familiar landscape giving way to unknown territory, both physically and emotionally. She had never been so far from home, had never acted with such defiance against her family's wishes. Yet there was a curious lightness growing within her chest, as though with each mile they covered, she shed another layer of expectation and obligation that had been wrapped around her since birth. Jackson rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders a solid presence in the moonlit darkness, a new North Star for her to follow. This was a man who had chosen his own path, who had lived by his wits and courage outside the boundaries of conventional society. There was freedom in that, she realized, even amid the danger and uncertainty that came with loving an outlaw. Perhaps that was what had drawn her to him from the beginning, not just his unexpected act of heroism during the stagecoach robbery, but the wildness in him that called to something buried deep within herself. Dawn broke over the eastern ridges, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that gradually illuminated the rugged landscape around them. They had been riding for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and take sips from their canteens. Eleanor's muscles ached from the unaccustomed duration in the saddle, but she said nothing, unwilling to slow their progress. Jackson led them to a small, hidden gully where a spring bubbled up between moss-covered rocks, forming a clear pool before continuing downhill as a narrow stream. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, helping Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Your father won't discover you're gone until morning, and even then, they'll likely search south first, toward California." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted for words, sinking down onto a fallen log while Jackson tended to the horses. The reality of what she had done was beginning to settle over her as the initial rush of adrenaline faded. She had abandoned everything: family, position, security, for a man with a price on his head, a man who lived by his own code in a world that had branded him irredeemable. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled shadows through the leaves above, Eleanor watched Jackson moving efficiently around their small camp, his movements those of a man accustomed to life on the run. He was different here, away from the constraints of town and the need for constant vigilance. There was an ease to his posture, a natural grace that came from years of relying on his own strength and wits for survival. When he had built a small fire and set coffee to boil in a battered tin pot, he came to sit beside her on the log, close but not touching, as if suddenly uncertain of his right to such familiarity. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames rather than her face. Eleanor considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would shape whatever lay ahead for them. "No," she said finally, reaching for his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life. "I'm afraid, yes. I'm mourning what I've left behind, but I don't regret choosing you." Jackson's fingers tightened around hers, and when he turned to look at her, the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. This was not the notorious outlaw feared throughout the territory, but simply a man offering his heart, with all its damaged pieces, to the woman who had risked everything to be with him. They rested through the hottest part of the day, sleeping in shifts, a habit Jackson insisted upon, despite Eleanor's belief that they were far enough from town to relax their guard. "Your father has connections," he reminded her as she tried to argue, "and money enough to hire trackers who could follow us through hell itself if properly motivated." She couldn't dispute this, knowing all too well the reach of Robert Montgomery's influence and the depth of his determination when crossed. So she took the first watch while Jackson slept, his face softened in repose, the hard lines of weariness temporarily erased. It was in these quiet moments that Eleanor could study him freely, the scars that told stories he rarely shared, the premature silver threading through dark hair at his temples, the strength evident even in rest. This was the man society had condemned, the man her father believed would bring her nothing but pain. Yet as she watched a dream flicker behind his closed eyelids, she saw not a hardened criminal, but a soul seeking redemption, a chance to become something more than the sum of his past mistakes. As evening approached, they prepared to continue their journey north. Jackson checked and rechecked their supplies, his movements efficient, but tinged with a nervousness Eleanor hadn't seen in him before. "What is it?" she asked, catching his arm as he passed by her, for the third time, with the same determined expression. He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about what you've given up for me," he admitted, voice low. "A comfortable life, your family's love, security, everything a woman like you deserves." The implication hung unspoken between them, that he, with his violent past and uncertain future, could never provide what she had left behind. Eleanor stepped closer, placing her palm against his cheek, feeling the ridge of the scar beneath her fingers. "What I deserve," she said firmly, "is to choose my own path with the man I love. Everything else is just trappings." Jackson covered her hand with his own, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt or regret. Finding none, he nodded once, decisively, then helped her mount her horse. As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky, they rode onward, two figures moving steadily northward, through the vast, indifferent beauty of the untamed West. They traveled for 2 more days, following game trails and narrow passes known only to those who lived beyond the reach of civilization. Jackson led them through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, the mountains rising around them like ancient sentinels guarding the secrets of the land. They spoke little during these long hours of riding, saving their energy for the journey, but in the evenings, when they made camp, a new intimacy grew between them. Away from the judgmental eyes of society, Eleanor found herself relaxing into a version of herself she had never been permitted to express, one who could laugh freely, speak her mind without fear of impropriety, and express her desires without shame. Jackson, too, seemed to shed layers of his hardened exterior, revealing a man of surprising gentleness and depth. He told her stories of his childhood in Missouri before the war, of his dreams before circumstances and bad choices had set him on the outlaw trail. "I wasn't born to this life," he confessed one night as they sat beside a small fire, the horses tethered nearby. "My father was a blacksmith, an honest man who taught me his trade. But after he died in the war and the bank took our land, I found that honesty didn't fill an empty belly." Eleanor listened, recognizing that he was offering her not excuses for his past, but understanding of how he had become the man he was, a man now determined to forge a different path. "The cabin we're heading to," Jackson continued, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. "I bought it with the last of my take from a bank job in Colorado. Paid cash, used a different name. It was meant to be a bolt hole, somewhere to lie low if things got too hot. But the moment I saw that valley, I started thinking maybe it could be something else, a real home." He looked up at her then, the firelight catching on the angles of his face, illuminating hope and fear in equal measure. "I've never had a home, not since I was a boy. Never thought I deserved one, truth be told." Eleanor moved to sit beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his coat. "Then we'll make one together," she promised, the words both a pledge and a prayer. That night, beneath a blanket of stars and wrapped in each other's arms for warmth, they slept more soundly than either had in years, as if the land itself had granted them a temporary reprieve from the ghosts of their pasts. On the morning of the fourth day, they crested a ridge, and Jackson reined in his horse, gesturing for Eleanor to do the same. Before them stretched a hidden valley, emerald green with spring grass, bisected by a clear stream that gleamed silver in the morning light. Nestled against the far slope, partially sheltered by a stand of tall pines, stood a cabin, small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. "There it is," Jackson said, his voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might cause the peaceful scene to vanish like a mirage. "Our new beginning." Eleanor took in the sight, feeling a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. It was beautiful in its simplicity, so different from the grand Montgomery ranch with its many rooms and fine furnishings. Yet something about the modest cabin and the surrounding wilderness spoke to her soul in a way her childhood home never had. This place belonged to no society, answered to no rules but those of nature itself. "It's perfect," she whispered, reaching for Jackson's hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, squeezing gently in acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Then they urged their horses forward, descending the slope toward the future they had chosen together. The cabin was as Jackson had described, basic but sound, with a main room containing a hearth, table, and chairs, a small bedroom, and a lean-to at the back for storage. A thin layer of dust covered every surface, evidence of his long absence. But Eleanor saw past this to the potential beneath. Windows on three sides allowed light to pour in, illuminating rough-hewn log walls that had been carefully chinked to keep out the winter cold. Someone had taken care with the building of this place, and she wondered briefly about its history. What stories these walls might tell if they could speak. Jackson moved around the space with a curious mix of ownership and uncertainty, as if not quite believing he had the right to claim this sanctuary. "It needs work," he said, running a hand along the mantel where his fingers left tracks in the dust. "And it's nothing like what you're used to." But Eleanor silenced him with a kiss, her first act of true boldness since they had fled Redemption Creek. When she pulled back, the look of wonder on his face made her heart swell. "It's ours," she said simply, the declaration washing away any lingering doubts. They spent the remainder of that day cleaning and preparing the cabin, working side by side in a domestic harmony neither had experienced before. Jackson repaired a loose shutter and checked the chimney for nests or blockages, while Eleanor swept and scrubbed until the small space gleamed with welcome. By evening, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the main room where they shared a simple meal of jerky and the last of their trail provisions. "Tomorrow I'll hunt," Jackson said, leaning back in his chair, more relaxed than Eleanor had ever seen him. "There's deer in these hills, and grouse too. We can start a garden come spring, and there's a trading post a day's ride east where we can get flour, coffee, the things we can't produce ourselves." He spoke with the confidence of a man who had survived by his wits in the wilderness, but there was something more in his voice now, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Eleanor listened, watching the firelight play across the planes of his face, seeing in him not the outlaw her father feared, but a man capable of building something lasting. "What will we tell people?" she asked, voicing a practical concern that had nagged at her throughout their journey. "About who we are, where we came from." Jackson considered this, his expression turning serious. "As far as anyone around here knows, I'm Jack Black, a hunter who keeps to himself. You?" He hesitated, eyes searching hers. "You could be my wife. We could say we were married in California, decided to make a fresh start up north." The proposal hung in the air between them, unexpected yet inevitable. Eleanor felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the realization that this was what she wanted, not just to flee with Jackson, but to build a life with him, to claim him openly as hers, despite what society might think of such a union. "Yes," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I would be proud to be known as your wife, in name and in truth." Something shifted in Jackson's expression then, a softening around his eyes that spoke of emotions too profound for words. Later, as they lay together in the small bedroom, the moon casting silver light through uncurtained windows, Eleanor thought of all that had transpired to bring her to this moment. The stagecoach robbery that had first brought Jackson into her life, the secret meetings facilitated by the old blacksmith, her father's unyielding rejection of her choice. "Do you think they're still searching for us?" she whispered into the darkness. Feeling Jackson's arm tighten around her waist, "Your father won't give up easily," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "But even Robert Montgomery's reach has limits. This valley is beyond the territories most men know. We're safe here, as long as we're careful." Eleanor nodded against his chest, knowing he was right, yet unable to fully shake the shadow of her father's final words to her, the warning that some choices could not be undone. But as sleep claimed her, wrapped in the warmth of Jackson's embrace, she found that the fear of those consequences seemed to diminish with each passing hour, replaced by a growing certainty that she had made the only choice possible for her heart. Spring blossomed into summer, and the hidden valley became home in ways Eleanor had never anticipated. She learned to hunt alongside Jackson, to track game through the forest, and bring down a deer with a clean shot, skills her father would have considered wildly inappropriate for a genteel woman, but which brought her a fierce pride and sense of accomplishment. They expanded the garden, adding rows of vegetables that thrived in the fertile soil beside the stream. Twice, Jackson made the journey to the trading post, returning with flour, sugar, coffee, and fabric for curtains and clothing. Each time he went alone, unwilling to risk Eleanor being seen until they were certain no one was searching for the daughter of Robert Montgomery or the outlaw Jackson Blackwood. These separations were difficult, days of anxiety, until she spotted him riding up the valley. But they strengthened the bond between them, making their reunions all the sweeter for the absence. On his second return, Jackson brought news. Rumor had it that the Montgomery family had spread word that their daughter had died of fever while traveling in California, a fiction that gave Eleanor both pain and a strange sense of relief. "They've buried you in their minds," Jackson said as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "It's their way of maintaining appearances, I suppose." Eleanor nodded, understanding her parents' need to create a narrative that preserved the family's dignity rather than admit their daughter had chosen an outlaw over a respectable match. "Then let Eleanor Montgomery rest in peace," she said after a contemplative silence. "I'm Eleanor Black now, and this is where I belong." Jackson reached for her hand, his eyes reflecting the dying light of day as he studied her face for any sign of regret. Finding none, he smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that transformed his scarred features into something approaching handsome. "I wake each morning afraid I've dreamed you," he admitted, voice rough with emotion. "That I'll open my eyes and find myself alone again, on the run, with nothing but my past for company." Eleanor leaned into him, her head finding the familiar spot on his shoulder that seemed made for her. "This is no dream," she assured him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "This is the reality we've chosen, the life we're building together." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above them, they remained on the porch, two figures silhouetted against the last light of day, watching darkness claim the valley that had become their sanctuary. Autumn came again, painting the surrounding forests in vibrant hues of gold and crimson, and with it, the knowledge that they had survived a full turning of the seasons in their hidden valley. The cabin had been transformed in those months. Curtains now hung at the windows, a collection of books lined shelves Jackson had built from pine boards. And Eleanor's touches were evident in every corner, from dried wildflower arrangements to carefully stitched quilts that would ward off the coming winter's chill. They had established a rhythm to their days, rising with the sun to tend the garden and hunt, spending evenings by the fire, reading aloud from Jackson's small collection of books, or simply talking, sharing pieces of themselves that they had never revealed to another soul. It was during one such evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the valley, that Eleanor shared her news. "I'm with child," she said softly, watching Jackson's expression shift from surprise to wonder to a deep, almost reverent joy. He knelt before her chair, placing a trembling hand on her still flat stomach, as if trying to comprehend the miracle they had created together. "A family," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I never thought, never dared to hope." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, understanding all that he couldn't articulate. A child meant roots, permanence, a stake in the future that neither of them had fully allowed themselves to imagine until now. It meant that their choice to flee together, to build this life away from society's judgment, had created something precious and new. A family, untainted by the Montgomery fortune or Jackson's outlaw past. "We'll need to prepare," she said practically, though her heart was soaring. "The baby will come in late spring. We should expand the cabin, perhaps add another room." Jackson nodded, already calculating what would be required, his mind working with the same methodical care he applied to every aspect of their survival. But beneath the practical considerations, Eleanor saw a fundamental change in him, a new sense of purpose, as if the coming child had given him a reason to fully embrace the redemption he had been seeking since they fled together. He looked up at her, his scarred face transformed by a smile of pure happiness. "I love you." "Eleanor Black," he said, using the name she had chosen for herself, the name that represented not the privileged daughter of a wealthy rancher, but the woman who had walked away from everything familiar to forge her own path. Winter descended on the hidden valley, blanketing the world in pristine white that glittered like diamonds in the clear mountain sunlight. The cabin stood as a warm sanctuary against the cold, smoke curling from the chimney into the crystal air, windows glowing with lamplight as darkness fell early each evening. Jackson worked tirelessly through those short days, felling trees and preparing lumber for the cabin expansion, determined to have the new room ready before the baby arrived. Eleanor watched his transformation with quiet joy. The former outlaw, who had lived by his gun, now channeled his considerable strength and determination into building a future, into creating safety and comfort for the child they would welcome in spring. When heavy snow made outdoor work impossible, they spent long hours by the fire, Jackson's hand resting gently on Eleanor's growing belly, feeling the flutter of new life beneath his palm with an expression of wonder that never dimmed. "What shall we name this little one?" he asked one evening, as wind howled around the cabin eaves, rattling the shutters against the log walls. Eleanor considered the question seriously, understanding its significance. "If it's a boy," she said finally, "I'd like to name him Robert." Jackson looked surprised, his brows drawing together in confusion. "After your father, the man who disowned you?" Eleanor nodded, meeting his gaze steadily. "My father is a proud, stubborn man who couldn't see past your scars to the person you truly are. But he is also the man who taught me to stand firm in my convictions, to fight for what I believe in, even when that meant fighting him. Without those lessons, I might never have found the courage to choose you." Jackson was silent for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his thoughtful face. "And if it's a girl?" he asked finally, his voice soft with acceptance of her reasoning. Eleanor smiled, placing her hand over his where it rested on her rounded belly. "Then we'll name her Hope, for all that she represents to us, a new beginning, a future neither of us thought possible." The winter months passed in peaceful isolation, their world narrowed to the cabin and the snow-covered valley beyond its walls. They saw no other human beings, their only company the deer that came down from the higher elevations to paw through snow for winter graze, the wolves whose howls echoed from distant ridges on clear, cold nights. It was a time out of time, suspended between the lives they had left behind and the future that awaited them with the spring thaw and the birth of their child. In these quiet months, Eleanor sometimes thought of her family, her mother, who had taught her to manage a household with grace and efficiency, skills that served her well in their simple cabin. Her younger brother, who had looked up to her with adoration and who would now grow to manhood believing his sister dead. And her father, whose stern face appeared in her dreams, sometimes angry, sometimes sorrowful. She wondered if Robert Montgomery ever regretted his ultimatum, if he ever looked toward the northern mountains and wondered if his daughter had found happiness with the man he had deemed unworthy. Such thoughts came less frequently as her pregnancy advanced, as the future claimed more of her attention than the past. Jackson completed the cabin addition before the deepest snows of February made travel beyond their immediate surroundings impossible. The new room was small but sturdy, with a window facing east to catch the morning light. Together, they prepared for the coming child. Eleanor sewing tiny garments from fabric Jackson had brought from the trading post, Jackson crafting a cradle from pine wood, his large hands working with surprising delicacy as he smoothed each surface to satin perfection. "No splinters for our little one," he said with a grin as Eleanor ran her fingers along the finished piece. It was in moments like these that she saw most clearly the man Jackson might have been had life treated him more kindly. Not an outlaw, living by his wits and his gun, but a craftsman, taking pride in honest work. A man building rather than taking. The transformation she witnessed in him daily only strengthened her conviction that she had made the right choice in defying her family, in believing that a man could be more than the sum of his past mistakes. Spring arrived with sudden warmth that melted the snow in great rushing streams, turning the valley brilliant green almost overnight. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and birds returned to nest in the pines surrounding the cabin. Eleanor's time drew near, her body heavy with the child that kicked and tumbled beneath her heart. Jackson rarely left her side now, having stockpiled enough provisions to last them through the birth and early days of parenthood. They spent long hours on the porch, watching the rebirth of the natural world around them, seeing in it a reflection of the new life they awaited. "I never thought I'd know peace like this," Jackson confessed one evening as the setting sun turned the distant peaks to gold. "All those years on the run, looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. I was just surviving, not living." Eleanor reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, feeling the familiar texture of calluses and scars against her palm. "And now?" she asked, though she could see the answer in the contentment that had settled into his features, softening the hard lines etched there by years of hardship. Jackson's gaze swept over the valley, the cabin they had made their own, before returning to rest on her face. "Now I understand what I was really running toward all those years, not just what I was running from," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had found unexpected redemption. "I was searching for this, a place to belong, someone to belong to, a purpose beyond just making it to the next day." He placed his free hand on the swell of her belly, feeling the strong kick of their child beneath his palm. "You gave me that, Eleanor. You saw something in me worth saving, when everyone else, including myself, had written me off as irredeemable." Eleanor blinked back tears, moved by the raw honesty in his words, in the way he looked at her, as if she were some kind of miracle he still couldn't quite believe was real. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "I was drowning in a life that was never meant for me, suffocating under the weight of others' expectations. You showed me another way to live, one true to myself, rather than to some idea of who I should be." Their child, a daughter they named Hope, as planned, was born as dawn broke over the eastern ridges, filling the cabin with golden light that seemed to Eleanor, exhausted from hours of labor, like a blessing from heaven itself. Jackson cradled the tiny, red-faced infant with hands that trembled slightly, his scarred face transformed by an expression of such tender awe that it brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled bundle to Eleanor's arms. "Perfect and fierce, just like her mother." Eleanor looked down at their daughter, at the delicate features that somehow combined elements of both parents, and felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. This was what she had chosen when she walked away from wealth and position. Not just Jackson, but the possibility of this moment. This tiny person who represented all their hopes for the future. As the new family huddled together in the warm light of morning, the outside world, with all its judgments and dangers, seemed very far away indeed. The months that followed passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy as they adjusted to life with an infant. Hope thrived in their care, growing stronger daily, her curious eyes taking in the world around her with an intelligence that made both parents proud. Jackson proved himself a natural father, his fierce protectiveness balanced by a surprising gentleness that emerged whenever he held his daughter. He would spend hours with her on the porch, pointing out birds and deer, murmuring stories of the land around them, as if she could understand every word. Eleanor watched these interactions with a full heart, seeing in them healing for wounds Jackson had carried far longer than the visible scars on his face, wounds of rejection, of being deemed worthless by a society that had no place for men who didn't fit its narrow definitions of value. In their daughter's unconditional love and acceptance, Jackson found something he had never experienced before: belonging without condition or judgment, love without fear of loss. As summer reached its height, turning the valley into a lush paradise of wildflowers and tall grasses rippling in the warm breeze, Eleanor began to feel a strange restlessness. It wasn't discontent with their life. She loved their home, their daily routines, the family they had created together. But as hope grew, so did Eleanor's awareness of the world beyond their hidden valley, the world their daughter would one day need to navigate. "We can't stay isolated forever," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, Hope sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. "Not if we want Hope to know more than just these mountains, this cabin." Jackson's expression tightened, the old wariness returning to his eyes. "It's dangerous out there for me," he reminded her. "The law hasn't forgotten Jackson Blackwood, even if we've been lucky so far." Eleanor nodded, understanding his fear, but also seeing beyond it to a larger truth. "But the law doesn't know Jack Black, the hunter who lives with his wife and daughter in the northern mountains. The man who brings furs and game to trade, who minds his business and causes no trouble." It was a risky proposition, she knew. Stepping even partially back into the wider world meant potential recognition, exposure. Yet complete isolation carried its own dangers, particularly for a child who would someday need education, friends, a broader understanding of life beyond their valley. "We start small," she suggested, seeing the conflict in Jackson's eyes. "The trading post first, together as a family. Then perhaps the settlement beyond, gradually expanding our circle while being careful, always careful." Jackson was silent for a long moment, looking down at the sleeping infant in his arms, her small face peaceful in slumber. "She deserves more than a life in hiding," he finally acknowledged, his voice rough with emotion. "More than a father she has to keep secret." Eleanor reached out to touch his cheek, fingers tracing the scar that had once defined him in the eyes of society, but that had become, to her, simply another beloved feature of the face she woke to each morning. "You've changed, Jackson. I've watched it happen day by day since we came here. The man you were is not the man you are now. Not the man our daughter knows as her father." Their first venture beyond the valley came in late summer, a carefully planned journey to the trading post Jackson had visited alone in the past. They traveled slowly, mindful of Hope securely bundled against Eleanor's chest, taking frequent breaks to rest and care for the infant. Jackson remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead and behind. Old habits of caution, not easily set aside. But when they arrived at the small outpost, little more than a sturdy cabin with attached storeroom, operated by a grizzled former trapper named Hansen, they were greeted with nothing more threatening than mild curiosity about the hunter's previously unknown family. "So you've been keeping secrets, Jack," Hansen commented as he admired the baby, his weathered face softening at Hope's toothless smile. "Can't say I blame you. Pretty wife, beautiful child. Man likes to keep his treasures safe." Jackson tensed slightly at the words, but Eleanor stepped smoothly into the conversation, offering the story they had agreed upon, that they had married in California, decided to seek a simpler life in the mountains after losing family in an epidemic. Hansen accepted this without question, more interested in the furs and smoked venison Jackson had brought to trade than in the details of their past. As Eleanor wandered the small store, selecting cloth, coffee, and other supplies they couldn't produce themselves. She felt a curious mix of anxiety and exhilaration at this first contact with the outside world in over a year. She had once moved confidently through the highest social circles of Nevada territory, but now found herself nervous in this simple trading post, aware of how much was at stake should someone recognize her as the supposedly deceased daughter of Robert Montgomery. Yet no one did. To Hanson and the two trappers who stopped by during their visit, she was simply Mrs. Black, a pretty young mother married to the quiet hunter who lived in the Northern Valley. It was both liberating and unsettling, this new identity that was both chosen and necessary, both true and false in its foundations. When they rode home that evening, Hope sleeping peacefully in the sling across Eleanor's chest, the valley welcomed them back with the golden light of sunset, spilling across meadows filled with late summer wildflowers. "It went well," Eleanor said as they unsaddled the horses, Jackson's posture gradually relaxing now that they were safely back in their sanctuary. "No one looked at us twice. We were just another family passing through." Jackson nodded, though she could still see the wariness lingering in his eyes. "This time," he acknowledged, "but each time we venture out is another risk, another chance for someone to recognize me or you." Eleanor understood his fear. It was a fear she shared, though perhaps not to the same degree. For her, the risk of discovery meant shame, rejection by the society she had once belonged to. For Jackson, it could mean a hangman's noose. Yet she also understood, with increasing clarity, that they could not build a future based solely on fear and hiding. "We'll be careful," she promised, reaching for his hand as they walked toward the cabin that glowed with welcome in the gathering dusk. "But we won't live in fear, Jackson. That would be giving too much power to the past, and our life is about the future now." That night, after Hope had been fed and settled in her cradle, they sat before the hearth, the familiar crackle of the fire, a counterpoint to the new thoughts and possibilities stirred by their venture beyond the valley. "I've been thinking," Jackson said, his voice thoughtful as he stared into the dancing flames, "about building something more than just our life here, about becoming part of something larger." Eleanor waited, giving him space to find the words for what he was considering. "Hanson mentioned that the settlement beyond the trading post is growing. They're building a proper town now. There's talk of a school, a church. They need skilled hands for construction, for making furniture and tools." He looked up from the fire, meeting Eleanor's gaze with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I was a blacksmith's son before I was an outlaw. I still remember the trade, still have the skills my father taught me. A growing town needs a blacksmith, needs someone who can work with metal and wood." The implication hung unspoken between them, a permanent connection to the wider world, a role in the community beyond the isolated existence they had built. Eleanor considered the idea carefully, seeing both its promise and its peril. A respected trade would give Jackson a place in society, a way to provide for their family beyond hunting and subsistence farming. It would give Hope access to education, to other children, to a community that could enrich her life in ways their isolated cabin could not. Yet it would also mean far greater exposure, more opportunities for someone to look past Jack Black the blacksmith and see Jackson Blackwood the outlaw. "Is that what you want?" she asked finally, studying his face in the firelight. "To build that kind of life?" Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought rather than agitation. "I want our daughter to have choices," he said, after a long pause. I want her to know more of the world than just these mountains, however beautiful they are. And I want, he hesitated, as if uncertain whether to voice his deepest hope. I want to know if redemption is possible not just in hiding, but in the open. If a man can truly leave his past behind and build something worthwhile in its place. The decision, once made, unfolded gradually over the months that followed. Jackson began by making regular trips to the trading post, offering his services for metalwork repairs, slowly building a reputation for skilled craftsmanship. Hansen proved an unexpected ally, recommending the quiet hunter to travelers who needed a horse shod or a wagon axle repaired. Word spread to the growing settlement beyond, and by the time the first snow dusted the high peaks, Jackson had established himself as a valuable resource for the scattered community. Eleanor supported this careful emergence from isolation, managing their home and caring for Hope while adding her own contributions, jams from wild berries, carefully tanned hides, occasionally medicines made from herbs she gathered and prepared, according to knowledge passed down from the Montgomery family's cook, who had learned from native healers. They were building not just a livelihood, but a place within the community, step by careful step, always watchful, but increasingly confident that the ghosts of their past lives remained far away. Winter came again, confining them largely to their valley, but bringing a peace and contentment that deepened with each passing day. Hope took her first steps across the cabin floor, her delighted laughter filling the small space with joy that made even the harshest days of mountain winter seem bright with promise. Jackson continued his metalwork when weather permitted, crafting items in the small forge he had built behind the cabin, preparing for increased trade when spring opened the mountain passes once more. Eleanor watched the transformation in him with quiet pride, the confidence that came from creating rather than destroying, from building a reputation based on skill and reliability rather than fear. His scars remained, visible reminders of a violent past, but they seemed to matter less now, overshadowed by the man he was becoming, the father and husband who returned each evening to the family that had given him reason to believe in second chances. On the rare occasions when Eleanor thought of her former life, the luxury and privilege she had left behind, it seemed distant and insubstantial compared to the rich, if simple, existence they had created together. Spring brought the anticipated expansion of Jackson's work as the settlement, now calling itself Pine Ridge, grew with the arrival of new settlers drawn by rumors of fertile land and opportunity. A proper smithy was established at the edge of what was becoming a town center, with Jackson traveling there 3 days each week to work, while Eleanor and Hope remained at their cabin, now surrounded by a thriving garden and a small orchard of young fruit trees they had planted the previous autumn. They had discussed moving closer to town for convenience, but both felt reluctant to leave the valley that had sheltered them through those first, crucial years of building their new life together. "This is home," Jackson said simply when Eleanor raised the possibility again after a particularly long day of travel between the cabin and town. "Our daughter took her first steps on this floor. We've put down roots here that go deeper than convenience." Eleanor had nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. The valley represented not just safety, but the foundation of their life together, the place where they had both been reborn into new versions of themselves. Summer brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Ridge, a circuit judge making his annual rounds through the scattered settlements of the territory, bringing law and resolution to disputes too complex for local management. Eleanor learned of this from the storekeeper's wife during a rare visit to town with Hope, now a sturdy toddler with Jackson's dark hair and Eleanor's green eyes. The news sent a chill through her, despite the warm day, and she made excuses to return home earlier than planned, pushing their small cart with its supplies along the familiar trail with more haste than usual. Jackson was at the forge when they arrived, hammering a length of red-hot iron with practiced strokes, his face intent on his work. He looked up at their approach, his smile of greeting fading as he caught sight of Eleanor's worried expression. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his hammer and wiping his hands on the leather apron that protected his clothes from sparks and grime. Eleanor waited until Hope had wandered off to examine a butterfly in the garden before speaking. "There's a judge in Pine Ridge," she said quietly. "Arrived yesterday. Will be there through the week, according to Mrs. Collins." Jackson's expression hardened, the old wariness returning to his eyes. "Federal or territorial?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Eleanor could sense the tension beneath. "Territorial, I think," she replied, trying to recall the details Mrs. Collins had shared. "Judge Monroe," she called him, said he comes through once a year to handle land disputes, criminal cases too serious for the local constable. Jackson nodded slowly, absorbing this information with a calmness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've heard of him. Fair man from what they say, but thorough. Keeps records of every wanted man in the territory." The implication hung between them. The risk they had always known existed, but had allowed themselves to think diminished with time and distance. "What should we do?" Eleanor asked, watching Hope as she chased the butterfly through the garden, her innocent laughter a stark contrast to the sudden tension of the moment. Jackson looked toward their daughter as well, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her carefree play. "Nothing hasty," he decided, after a thoughtful pause. "I'll avoid town while he's here. We have supplies enough to last a week. The judge doesn't come up to these hills unless there's specific business." They spent an anxious week, Jackson working at the home forge rather than in town, both of them jumping at unexpected sounds, a deer crashing through underbrush, a branch falling on the roof during a brief thunderstorm. It was a harsh reminder of the fragility of the life they had built, the ever-present threat that the past might reach out to reclaim them, despite all their efforts to create something new. When word finally came via Hanson that Judge Monroe had moved on to the next settlement on his circuit, the relief was palpable. Yet that night, as Hope slept peacefully in her small bed in the room Jackson had built for her, Eleanor found herself unable to rest, thoughts churning with questions about the future. "We can't live like this forever," she said softly to Jackson as they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Holding our breath every time someone new comes to town, wondering if today is the day our past catches up to us." Jackson nodded, his profile sharp against the darkness. "I know," he acknowledged, voice heavy with an understanding they both shared but rarely spoke aloud. "But what choice do we have?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, taking his hands in hers, hands that were still strong and calloused, but now from honest work rather than the grip of a gun. "We could leave," she suggested, the idea forming even as she spoke it. "Go further north, into Canada perhaps. Start completely fresh, where no one has heard of Jackson Blackwood or Eleanor Montgomery." It was a radical proposal, one they had discussed in the abstract during those early days of planning their escape from Redemption Creek, but had set aside once they found safety in the Hidden Valley. Jackson considered it silently, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "It would mean leaving everything we've built here, he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin that had been their sanctuary, the garden they had coaxed from rocky soil, the life they had crafted with care and determination, starting over again when we've only just begun to put down roots. Eleanor squeezed his hands, understanding the reluctance in his voice. It mirrored her own conflicted feelings about abandoning the home they loved. But we would be truly free, she countered softly. No more looking over our shoulders, no more fear of recognition. Just us, our family, our future without the shadow of the past. The decision did not come quickly or easily. They discussed it over many evenings after Hope was asleep, weighing the security of the unknown against the precarious comfort of their established life. Jackson made discreet inquiries through traders who traveled further north, learning about the territories beyond the American border, about land available for settlement, communities where skilled craftsmen were welcomed. Eleanor sewed extra clothing for all of them, preserving the summer's abundant garden harvest, preparing in small ways for a journey she wasn't certain they would undertake. Autumn painted the valley in gold and crimson, a beauty so profound it made the thought of leaving all the more difficult. "If we go," Jackson said one evening, as they stood watching the sunset from their favorite spot above the cabin, "we should wait until spring. Winter travel with a child would be too dangerous." Eleanor nodded, leaning against his side, feeling the solid warmth of him through the cooling air. "That gives us time," she replied, "to be certain it's what we truly want, and to prepare properly if it is." The decision, when it finally crystallized, came not from long discussion, but from a moment of clarity neither had anticipated. Winter had settled over the valley, the cabin snug against the cold, Hope delighting in the snow that transformed her familiar world into a wonderland of white. Jackson had ventured to town despite the difficult travel, needing supplies they couldn't postpone until better weather. He returned earlier than expected, his expression grave as he stomped snow from his boots at the cabin door. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, immediately alert to the tension in his posture. Jackson glanced at Hope, playing contentedly with carved wooden animals by the hearth, before answering in a lowered voice. "There was a stranger in town, asking questions. A man I didn't recognize, but Hanson said he showed a badge. Pinkerton, not local law." Eleanor felt her heart constrict with familiar fear. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was known for its persistence in tracking criminals across state lines, for the long memory of its agents who might spend years pursuing a single case. "Did Hanson tell him anything?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the alarm rising within her. Jackson shook his head. Not deliberately, but the man was clever. Asked about newcomers to the area over the past few years, specifically mentioned a blacksmith or metalworker. He ran a hand through his hair, snow melting from the dark strands. Hanson thought he was recruiting skilled workers for the railroad. Mentioned me as the local smith. Said I lived up in the northern valley with my wife and child. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this unwelcome development. "Do you think he was looking for you specifically, or just asking general questions?" Jackson's expression was grim. "Can't be certain, but the timing, the specificity of his questions, my gut says he's tracking someone, and that someone might be me, or possibly you. Your father has the money to keep Pinkertons on retainer for years if he wanted to." The implication hung between them, the precarious nature of their safety suddenly thrown into sharp relief. That night, after Hope was asleep, they made their decision, not in fear or haste, but with the clear-eyed recognition that the past would always find ways to reach toward them if they remained within its grasp. Canada, Jackson said simply, standing at the window, watching snow fall in the moonlight. In spring, when the pass is clear, we'll leave everything but what we can carry on pack horses. Eleanor nodded, coming to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. A true, fresh start, she agreed, feeling both sorrow at what they would leave behind and hope for what might lie ahead. They spent the remaining winter months in careful preparation, Jackson making sturdy traveling gear, Eleanor preserving food for the journey, both of them studying maps obtained from traders, planning a route that would keep them away from larger settlements until they crossed the border. They told no one of their plans, not even Hansen, who had become something of a friend over the years. The fewer who knew, the less chance of word spreading to unwelcome ears. Spring came with its customary rush of melting snow and new growth, the valley bursting into vibrant life as if encouraging their decision to seek renewal elsewhere. They packed only essentials, clothing, tools, and some precious books. A few precious books, the small wooden toys Jackson had carved for Hope, the silver hairbrush that was Eleanor's last connection to her mother. Everything else they would leave behind, a sacrifice to the promise of true freedom. On their final evening in the cabin that had sheltered them through those transformative years, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and rose. Hope sleeping peacefully inside after an exciting day of preparation. "Are we doing the right thing?" Eleanor asked softly, voicing the doubt that occasionally surfaced despite their careful deliberation. Jackson's arm tightened around her shoulders, his gaze fixed on the mountains that had been both their protection and their boundary. "I believe we are," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had gradually replaced the wariness of their early days together. Not running away this time, but moving towards something, a future where we don't have to look over our shoulders, where hope can grow up free from the shadows of our pasts. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, finding comfort in the solid strength of him. In the journey they had already traveled together from the day she had defied her family to choose a scarred outlaw over a respectable marriage. "I have no regrets," she whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being, not a single one. Jackson turned to look at her, the last light of day catching on the scars that had once defined him in the eyes of society, but that had become to Eleanor simply part of the face she loved beyond reason or sense. "Nor do I," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. Whatever comes next, we face it together, no longer the outlaw and the rancher's daughter, but simply Jack and Eleanor Black, making our own way." As darkness settled over the valley, stars emerging one by one in the vast mountain sky, they remained on the porch of the home they would soon leave behind, holding each other close, their hearts turned towards the horizon and whatever it might hold for the family they had created, against all odds and expectations. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.